Hey, how you doing? This is RJ. So, I've done many videos talking about the why and the when and the origins of bad entertainment, where it comes from, why it's happening, but I realized that I haven't really done a video focusing almost completely on the how. Sure, I focused on the how as in structurally, bad storytelling, all that kind of stuff. But today I'm going to focus a little bit more on the how as in to answer those comments that I get on a regular basis saying, I knew there was something wrong with this entertainment, I just didn't know what it was. And to be right up front with you, the answer to that question is, it's because our entertainment today is written by people, the majority of which should actually be in a mental institution. And before I get too far into that, a couple of sidebars first. Number one, I'm not going to be like those other YouTube channels who make excuses for this fact, who put little things in like, oh, but it's okay here and here. I'm not going to be one of those YouTube channels that says, here, I just told you something uncomfortable about the mental state of these people. Let me tell a joke. Or uses clips, like that clip of the Falcon where he says, he's out of line, but he's right. No, I'm just telling it to you straight up. Most of these people should be in a mental institution. No jokes, no takebacks, no putting in things where I can backpedal if I need to or if I get into trouble. Nope. In fact, I probably will title this video something like, Make Mental Institutions Great Again. The other aside being, I'm not talking about people who struggle with, anxiety or might have bouts of depression during their life. No, I'm talking about people who straight up need to have full-time care and should be in an institution because their mental state has degraded to such a degree they can't handle reality. Also, I'm probably going to have a looser form for this video. It's going to be more of a symposium, bringing up topics of discussion rather than making a direct argument. And oh, by the way, for those new people who inevitably put in the comments, why don't you shorten up your videos? Why don't you tighten up the script? I'll just tell you right now, as the older viewers know, I don't script anything. You think that I script my videos? You're crazy. All I do is turn on the microphone and talk. And finally, I'm probably going to just put up images of Superman and the American flag in the background, just to tick off those people that kept on coming up in my comments in the Superman video that I did 2 weeks ago saying, Superman has nothing to do with America. He renounced his citizenship in 2011. Yeah, whatever. But actually, Superman is a good place to start. Why? Because comic books is a good place to start. I honestly think that come, 20 years from now, when they look back on this period in history, a lot of the information that they're going to get and use to show how insane things were is going to be from the comic industry. And I think that for several reasons, not just because I've covered it for the last, 8 years. It's because comic books have always been the, poor country cousin of entertainment. And what do I mean by that? Well, here, let me get into another sidetrack. I actually grew up in the suburb of a major metropolitan area on the east coast of the United States. But we left there when I was a kid, mostly because of the cultural enrichment of the 1970s spread by mass immigration, which almost killed one of my brothers. But hey, after that, we moved out to the country, and I've been a country boy ever since. And I found that for the majority of my upbringing, which was in the 70s and the 80s, since it occurred in the country, I could have been quite honestly brought up in the 1950s. It wouldn't have made much difference. And I've noticed that in the last 20 years too, because I now live in the country as well, in one of the places that I lived. I have people that I know who brought up their children, yes, in the 2000s and 2010s, but the kids might as well have been brought up in the 1980s. Why? Because the parents are from 1980, and that's when they were brought up. And there's not a whole lot of incentive to change very rapidly out in the country. And I've noticed this with not just people bringing up their kids, but other countries as well, especially other countries that have strong connection to American entertainment and Americana, countries like Japan or South Korea. They tend to use a backdrop of Americana, which is probably about 20 to 30 years out of date. So it's a phenomenon. And I think it's a phenomenon with comics as well, for several reasons. In that entertainment went in this progressive direction, but comics didn't really keep up to it. Sure, it had a streak of it running throughout, but by the time the 1990s, the end of the 1990s, early 2000s came along, and all of entertainment was veering severely in that direction, comics was like the poor country cousin saying, Can I come along? Can I come along? Look, I'll do double what everybody else is doing just to prove that I deserve to be here. And because the medium of North American comics was superheroes, and the traditional idea of a superhero is a paragon of virtue, there was a massive shift from the old world, 1950s way of thinking and creating comics and superheroes into this new progressive world. And it has pretty much well documented. Again, for several reasons. One of those being the fact that, as I have said multiple times, comic books starting in the mid-aughts, pretty much forward, no longer had sales as their staple of staying alive. It was more relevance or awards, usually progressive type awards. And what good is an award unless you shout it to the housetops, unless you give multiple interviews about it, unless you talk constantly about it. And that's what they did. And that's why I had, for the first several years of my channel here, ample supply of these people talking about themselves and what they were doing to destroy entertainment in this quote-unquote progressive way. Now, I'll leave that strain of thought here and come back to it at the end, because I will come back to the idea of a traditional hero. But let's move on for a second and talk more about entertainment being created by literal crazy people. The question arises, why am I doing this video right now? Well, the question arises because I actually didn't know what I was going to do for a video this week. Usually I have some idea during the week. This week, not really. It's been a bit of a slow week. So usually when that happens, I go and look for something to do a video about. I go to usual sources like, I don't know, The Hollywood Reporter or Variety. I go to the Marvel website and see what's going on, stuff like that. And if I really can't find anything, finally, I end up on Twitter or X or whatever you want to call it. That's usually when I'm scraping the bottom of the barrel. And the thing is that I really don't like doing that, but I do it because, well, honestly, it's because Richard over at Comics Matter did it for so long. He would go on Twitter, or probably Blue Sky now, and look at these people's comic producers, look at their feed and see what they're talking about and all that kind of stuff. And he would do videos on it. And I tried to do that at the first of my channel. And I ended up only doing it about 2 or 3 times, I think. And the reason why I don't like doing it is because when you actually go to the Twitter feed, or I guess the Blue Sky feed now of these people, these comic producers, whether they be editors or writers, doesn't matter. It's like looking into the mind of a crazy person. And quite honestly, after a couple of minutes of scrolling through the feeds of such people, I feel disgusting. Because at some level, you're literally steeping yourself in madness. And I'm talking everybody from that guy who thinks he's a girl that Richard keeps talking about relentlessly to, I don't know, Kelly Sue DeConnick, who is just a straight up massive intersectional feminist. And for years, as the banner picture on her Twitter was a picture of herself with her eyes bleeding. And again, here's one of those times where I will say this unapologetically. My sense of disgust is justified. There's a video done by a YouTuber probably a couple of years ago now. His name is The Jolly Heretic. If I remember correctly, he's a professor of, I think, sociology or something like that. And he goes through studies. And he talked about the disgust reflex, because there was a study that showed that people on the left seem to have a lower level of a gag reflex or disgust reflex than people on the right. And then he went on to discuss how your gag reflex, your disgust reflex, is actually a biological plus that was put into human beings in order to keep them alive as individuals and as societies. Because typically you get disgusted by something that can harm you. And then he went on to talk about how in times past, those people who were born with this lack of disgust reflex would just simply die. They would do something stupid, like eat something that was completely disgusting. It would give them, I don't know, food poisoning, and they'd die. And so they would be weeded out of the population. But in modern day society, where we take more care of such people, and I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but where we take more care of such people, there has become an increasing level of people who are born without this disgust mechanism, or lower levels of this disgust mechanism. And again, what they did was they took people, asked them political questions, and then showed them pictures of disgusting things to analyze their disgust, their gag reflex. And they saw that people on the left typically have lower levels of a gag reflex than people on the right. And as I said, I'm not saying it's a bad thing we take care of such people, that they get to go to the hospital and they get their stomach pumped instead of actually dying when they eat something disgusting. And quite honestly, after having gone through so many of those podcasts and interviews and things like that, from especially these comic producers and people who are showrunners, show writers, I actually feel pity for many of them. Again, that fellow who thinks he's a girl, who was on the podcast that I talk about regularly, the one which is entitled Queering Legacy Characters. And by the way, someone in the comments asked if I could link it. It's probably still on YouTube. That's where I found it. Just put the name into the YouTube search bar or go to the Writers Guild of America YouTube page. It should be there. But this fellow was having a short discussion with someone else on the panel, talking about how he only had friends which were in the rainbow community of a very certain kind. And one of the panelists said, "I wish I had your life." And he answered, "No, you don't." And at that moment, it was just so monumentally sad. You could hear it in his voice. This is a person who is struggling mentally. This is a person whose life is a burden to them. So yeah, I feel pity for such people. But here's the thing. Up until about the 1950s, when you felt pity for such people, when you felt charity for such people, what did you do? Well, you did the charitable thing and put them in a mental institution. And again, the mechanism for this entire thing is not a giant mystery. It is a product of a creeping socialist political mentality. Why? Because you can go easily back to at least the 1910s and see socialist and or communist literature talking about how do you spread the message? Well, one of the basic tactics is to employ people with mental problems. It's in black and white in their strategy guide. Go, get them out there on the streets. Why? Because first of all, they're easy to convince. Second of all, they're easy to rile up and make violent. And thirdly, when you turn them into a weapon, you really don't care. They're just cannon fodder. And by the way, if anybody wants a good book to read that really breaks down a lot of different kinds of institutions that have done this exact thing, there's a good book called, if I remember correctly, The Architecture of the Culture of Death. Although, by the way, it's written by two professors who are both philosophers and theologians, leaning heavily on the traditions of Thomas Aquinas and John Paul II. But they talk about, in each different chapter, going back hundreds of years, different movements and institutions which incorporate this death cult mentality into their movement, and how it is, quite honestly, a mental illness. In the more modern chapters, they do everything from the Kinsley Institute to Vogue magazine. And let's just go down that sidetrack for 1 second. Many of these mental problems that we see around us in our society today are based upon things that in most societies and times in history would be sexual practices that would make people disgusted. Why? Because of the Kinsley Institute. Why? Because they produced so-called studies to show that these kinds of aberrations were actually what was normal within America. How? Well, when World War II was on, they decided to do their studies at that point when all the real men were off fighting. And so they needed men to actually ask the question, what do you consider normal in a sexual way? So where would they go to find men? Oh, they went to the prisons. That's where the rest of the men were. And in the prisons, they found that only a certain section of people would actually talk about such things. They would be the people who were in prison for crimes concerning such matters. And so they took that as their standard of, yes, this is what the normal American male actually thinks of as sexually normal. Can you see why our society is in the problem state that it is right now? That kind of mentality took about 2 decades to matriculate, and finally we get to the 1960s with the sexual revolution, and the rest is history, especially arm in arm with the fact that within the 1960s, they started to pressure everybody to let people out of mental institutions so that they could roam free on the streets. Why? Because that would supposedly, according to studies, be better for their mental health. No, it just made the rest of us all sicker, made the rest of our societies sicker. And then, oh, by the way, there was a mechanism put in place to ignore such sickness, so it was never discussed. That was actually one of the things that Vogue magazine was known for. Never talk about anything to have to do with ugliness. Never talk about anything that has to do with pain or suffering or death or disease, especially not when it comes to those self-destructive habits which have to do with sexual immorality. No, never talk about that. It was literally one of the forbidden subjects within the magazine for at least up until the 2000s. And that's a good place to come full circle and talk once again about entertainment, because things like Vogue magazine are entertainment. But if you head more directly into the type of entertainment that I talk about, entertainment that is based upon a story, what do you get typically with a story today? Well, typically you get the exact same thing I was talking about when I go to the Twitter pages of the people who write these stories. You get to see into the mind of a crazy person. They take story, which traditionally is supposed to be, 1, a rhetorical argument, and 2, a reflection of reality, and that's the traditional description of a story, going back at least 2,400 years. That's how you construct a good story. Why? Because being a story, it's not reality. You need your audience to engage their suspension of disbelief. In order to engage their suspension of disbelief, you can't jump the shark. You need to have it somewhat in the realm of reality in order for your audience to engage their suspension of disbelief, in order for them to engage within the story itself and take it in. If you push them too far so that it breaks their suspension of disbelief, and they look at the page or they look at the screen and they say, yeah, this is just a story, as they're reading, as they're watching, you have failed at your task of entertaining. That's assuming, of course, that most of these people actually write stories to entertain, which is a big topic of discussion on its own, which I've talked about many a times. And sure, again, as a rhetorical argument, I talk about science fiction and fantasy. That's just an if-then statement that you can use in a logical way to say, okay, we have reality. You're set up in reality. You have your suspension of disbelief. Let's add an if-then to this reality to see what would happen. Not too far, not too much, just enough so that we can answer the if-then question, but keep you in that suspension of disbelief. But modern stories are not that. Modern stories are written by people who have mental problems. And again, I've done multiple videos where I've covered podcast after article, where I go over the exact words of writers from comics and shows and movies. And what do they always talk about at some point? They talk about their mental problems. And oh, by the way, if you didn't go see Thunderbolts, that's the basic premise of the entire thing. You have these heroes and villains who have mental problems. Let's go deep into that subject. But again, the point is, what you're seeing on the page, on the screen, is a constructed reality based upon madness. And quite honestly, why? Well, again, to push the political ideology in a certain way. How? By getting more supporters. How? By exposing you to a story wherein, when you read a story, your mental defense system is usually lowered to some degree. But during that lowering of your mental defenses, to expose you over and over again to disgusting things in order to break down your disgust reflex, in order for you to see these things as not as disgusting as you did before. And therefore, what do? Well, then you will align with the other people who see it that way, which are what? Usually on the left. Which what? Supports these political ideologies, which let these crazy people out on the streets to use them as cannon fodder. And to bring it back to one of my points previously, this is why the traditional way of creating, let's say, comic books and heroes is so diametrically opposed to the kind of entertainment that you get right now. Why? Well, because, let's take a look at the fact that previous to the modern period, there really weren't things called mental institutions. These people were just segregated into parts of particular life, if they survived, and were seen as abnormalities, to say the least. Abnormalities according to what? Abnormalities according to what used to be the standard of how to live according to reality. And what was that standard? Well, that standard was both philosophical and theological. It was to answer the question, how do I live a good life? And the answer to that question, how do you live a good life? For both was virtue. And what is a traditional hero? A traditional hero traditionally is a paragon of virtue. The exact same virtues that philosophy and theology talked about: prudence, justice, fortitude, temperance, in that exact order, as the answer to how to live a good life. Or to put it in other terms, how do you live a good life? Well, you become heroic. And what's the initial starting point of getting to prudence, which is the first of those virtues? Well, it is right reason. And what is right reason? That is your reason in accord with reality. Or to put it another way, it is your mental state and your process of thinking in accord with what is real, which is the exact opposite of the mental process of people with mental problems, of people who are crazy, because quite literally, they can't mentally deal with reality. And so they construct a false reality based upon their own subjective mental illness. So yeah, unfortunately, until we have a society which will recognize all of these things around us as mental problems, once again, this is what you're going to get for entertainment. You're going to get a story based upon a reality that is based upon madness. And while I would hope and pray for a time in the near future where we could go back to the idea of what is the good life? How do you lead that? What are the virtues necessary for that to occur? And how do you implement them in your life? And how, as a secondary thought, do we diminish the voices in our society that are saying the opposite? I would love to get to that point in the near future, but unfortunately, that's just not how human beings work. We learn and grow and discover new truths through a step-by-step process. And we will never get to that point until we once again go through the step-by-step process of going back to making mental asylums great again. So, if I've given you anything new to think about, hit like, hit the shield in the lower right-hand corner of your screen to subscribe, and leave me a comment. Tell me what you think about all this. And don't forget, there is a link in the description for the sign-up page for my new book called Fade to Blue. If you go to that sign-up page, you can watch the trailer for the book. You can look at some of the art, and if you wish, you can leave your email address so you can be informed when the project goes live. All right, I'll leave it there. I'll see y'all later. Bye.